Before we get started with this episode, I wanted to go over some new merchandise offerings that I have. And these are probably my nicest shirts and hoodies to date, and the ones that I am the most excited about. So, the backstory, BP Auto Sports, my company, was started in 2009. And with this being 2024, that means that this is my 15th year in business. And that's a pretty big deal, at least for me, and something that I'm pretty excited about. And I wanted to release some shirts and hoodies to commemorate this special year. So what we have are BPA 15-year anniversary hoodies and 15-year anniversary t-shirts. And these are both available in a variety of colors and even some special limited edition colors, as evidenced by this olive drab green on the hoodie here. But both the hoodies and the shirts have the same design. They have the BPA logo on front, an American flag on the right shoulder facing the correct direction. So it's similar to how they do it in the military, always moving forward. The left sleeve, we have a nice TIG torch. If I can get this sleeve opened up. But we have a TIG torch on the left side. And then the back of the shirts is the side that is very, very special. The back of both the shirts and the hoodies have a nice big 15 years on the top. We have 2009 to 2024 for the years. And then we have a Mark IV Supra and a Neon SRT4 silhouettes for both of those cars, as those are my primary markets. And kind of the markets, or not kind of, they are the markets that have allowed me to continue to be in business and to build the business over time. So these shirts, I think they're really cool, or the shirts and the hoodies, I should say. You can see between the two of them, they have the same designs throughout. These are really special and something that I'm very excited to bring to market. Hopefully you guys like them as well. If these shirts and hoodies do speak to you, they are currently available in the limited edition section of my web store, and they'll be available from right now through the end of the year. At the end of the year, since it will no longer be 2024, the shirts and the hoodies will be no more. So you have essentially 6 months from right now to buy either of these pieces of apparel if they do speak to you. After that, they'll be lost to the ethers in just a good memory at that point in time. So they're available, like I said, in a few different color options, wide variety of sizes, and pick one up before the end of the year before they are gone. So thank you guys very much for 15 great years, a lot of good memories, cool projects, and everything else. I'm looking forward to the next 15 very much so. But before I run my suck anymore, let's go ahead and get to this episode. Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. So as you saw from the intro montage, I went ahead and began the plumbing on the Mark II. So it started off with something pretty simple, and that was just the fuel feed line. Now, I came off of the existing hard line down underneath the chassis, converted it over to this AN line, and like I said, it's a little bit dark, but the line runs up to the backside, the inlet of the fuel rail, and ties in via the hose end and the handy banjo bolt and banjo assembly that's in the back of the rail. So that admittedly is probably the easiest line to build on this entire car, but the rest of them really won't be too bad from what I can tell. So I'm waiting on a few other materials to come in, but this is an instance of I need to go backwards to go forwards. So to do this, I need to pull this upper intercooler tube, need to pull the whole turbo off, pretty much the whole turbo assembly, as I need to put my little fitting assortment, or fitting assembly rather, in place for the oil feed. Now as I'm doing that, I can also figure out some of the line lengths and so on and so forth for the oil filter relocation. And I'll also need to put the oil filter relocation plate somewhere on one of the frame rails as well. As you guys saw in the last little montage, I went ahead and I added an 8th NPT bung to the Mark II's oil filter relocation. And I wasn't extraordinarily happy with the way the welds came out, so I went ahead and did some sculpting to kind of blend it in a little bit. And this assembly, or this piece rather, will be powder coated wrinkled black, along with the block side plate as well. So the way that I did this is I took just a normal 8th NPT bung, put it roughly in place, welded around, and on the inside, I drilled that port right above my thumb there. So as this oil filter housing becomes pressurized, some of the oil will go up in there, and you guys probably won't be able to see it, but I ground a little bit of the edge off of the bung so that way oil can make its way into this new cavity here, and the sensor can see pressure that way. Pretty much the only other spot, or easy spot, that I could see to get oil pressure from was this fitting, or this hose end down in here. This is the actual port on the side of the block where I'm feeding oil to the turbo from, but I don't really want to mount the sensor on the engine itself, as all the vibrations and everything else that the engine produces with its cycle of controlled explosions can wreak havoc on sensors, and I don't really want to kill sensors if I don't have to. So with this relocation plate, it will end up being mounted over on this driver's side frame rail somewhere, probably somewhere in this location, and that will prevent the oil pressure sensor from getting vibrated to death, and it gives me a really nice, easy location to put the sensor into place to keep it away from heat and everything else, and to make it easy to run wires. Mark II's oil filter housing is now in place. So I attached it via 3 rivnets onto the frame rail right here. It puts the filter in a really nice location to get it on, get it off. It sits high enough, and it isn't going to cause a mess when it's time to do oil changes on this. So the lines are going to come out of these 2 ports right here, kind of run along the top of the frame rail, go behind the radiator, or I guess on the front side of the radiator rather, snake their way around along this frame rail, and then they'll go into the other plate, I guess the block side plate that'll be right here where my index finger is, and all will be well that way. The only thing I'll have to do is be cognizant about the line's proximity to the header, and I'll do some thermal management, get some heat sleeving or something along those lines, so that way I don't end up cooking the lines with the header. So now that we have at least the bulk of the difficult portion of the oil lines completed, let's go ahead and knock out the rest of the actual fuel lines, being the return line from the bottom side of the rail right in here to the inlet of the regulator, and then the outlet of the regulator down to the hard line itself. Well, the return side of the Mark II's fuel system is now all plumbed. So from the rail, we have our outlet down in here. See if I can get you guys in a better position. So right there is the outlet of the rail. You can see that line goes on the bottom of the intake manifold, and it comes up and terminates on this side of the regulator. This side over here is plugged up, but on the bottom side is where the outlet of the regulator is, and that line goes down, ties into the existing return line that was already on the car, and I did these little zip tie spacer deals. You guys can see right here, it's just one zip tie looped around, and then a zip tie ran in between the lines to hold everything together. So that's a cheap and effective way to do line spacers without spending a bunch of money on billet ones or anything like that. So now the feed and the return line are squared away. Although in the feed line, I'm going to get a secondary or another fuel filter. I may end up remaking the feed line that is in here already, as I have an excess of number 8 hose. And then I can come and use this bracket down in the engine bay right here where my index finger is to house another filter. I can have the line come in, go out, and then loop up and make its way into the banjo bolt back here. But I'll cross that bridge in a little bit. Right now I'm just happy that the lines are done, at least for the time being. And now I can move on to the largest lines of this whole setup, which are the oil filter relocation lines. Again, like I said earlier, going from that port on the block around the whole front of the car over to our oil filter relocation filter housing right there. Well, it's now time to knock out the portion of the Mark II's plumbing project that I've really been dreading. And that is to put an oil return bung in place. So maybe you guys can see right there that permanent marker mark. That is where the bung is going to be located. So whenever I'm putting bungs in place, I like to have the AN, like the tapered sealing surface, be removable. In that case, if you mess up the threads or mess up the taper, you can replace that rather than being kind of stuck with a bung the way that it is. So with that in mind, I have this number 10 ORB steel weld bung from the good folks at ARP. And this is what is going to be kind of the heart of the oil return for the turbo. So in order to get to the point where I can put that bung in place, the pan needs to come off. I need to drill a hole in it and then get to welding. So the difficult portion is going to be getting the pan out. I'm hoping that I can do this without dropping the subframe or lifting the engine, but I won't know until I start removing it. So rather than me running my suck, let's go ahead and start pulling the pan off, and hopefully we get lucky with this. Well, the Mark II's oil pan now has an oil return bung, and it came with a little bit of a blood sacrifice. You guys can see my hand right here. The gasket scraper slipped as I was taking the gasket off of the pan, and I ended up razor blading myself in the palm. Now, the bandage looks much more severe than the injury actually is, but since I still have work to do here, I wanted to make sure that I bandaged it in a manner that the bandage wouldn't come off. As if you guys have cut your hands before, you know there isn't a great way to bandage them. But that being said, here's the bung in its new home. Placed it pretty close to the center between these two bolt holes right here so I can still get to the fasteners easily. And this is ready to go back on the car, minus prepping the gasket surface, which I need to come in and take all this RTV off. And I'm also going to put a fresh coat of paint on this. So let's go ahead and prep for paint, get the old RTV off, and get this thing ready to go back on the car. Well, after some semi-unexpected general technician work, the Mark II is back together with an oil return bung in its oil pan. So while I had the pan out, I put a fresh coat of paint on it, put as many new fasteners as I could get, which the only two outstanding old ones are the two nuts right there. And most importantly, if we look up in here, right there is my new oil return bung. So now that is done, I can go ahead and get the oil return line knocked out, get the oil feed line knocked out. All of the turbo-related oil lines can be finished at this point in time. And the only lines that will be left to figure out at that point in time will be the coolant in and out for the center cartridge of the turbo. So this wasn't too bad of a deal to get the oil pan out. I did end up having to lift the engine up and drop the subframe down, and that allowed me enough clearance to get the oil pan past the sway bar right here. If it weren't for the sway bar, the oil pan would have slid out, but where the sway bar runs, it necessitated a little bit more in-depth disassembly and reassembly, but not the end of the world. And one other improvement that I made, or I hope that it's an improvement at least, was removing this cork gasket. Now you can see the gasket had a layer of RTV on it, and it was the old school, or the old way of doing a layer of RTV, gasket, layer of RTV on top of it. So I removed that. I put a fairly liberal layer of Honda Bond the whole way around it. You can see some of the RTV squishing out right around there. And I had really good luck with Honda Bond on the oil pan for the Mark IV, so I'm hoping that I'll have good luck with the oil pan on the Mark II as well. So I reworked the Mark II's fuel side plumbing a little bit, and much of it would have been difficult to capture on camera as I was in the middle of constructing it. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and look at what I've done off camera and what is coming next for this. So I mentioned earlier in the video that I thought about putting a pre-rail fuel filter in place, and I did just that. So if you guys can see down in this pocket right here, I have a Weldon, this is a 10 micron stainless steel fuel filter, number 8 in and out as far as the inlet and outlet sides are concerned. And rather than running this line down here where my index finger is just up to the rail, that line now comes to the inlet of the filter, and then the outlet of the filter comes up and runs to the banjo bolt on the backside of the fuel rail, kind of down in here if you can see. The other change that I made was I switched this fitting out from a 90 degree fitting to a 120 degree fitting, as that is a little bit more organic path for this line to take. There isn't a kink coming right out of the hose end, and I retied everything together and all is well there. So the next order of business is to knock out the oil feed and oil return for the turbo. And I have a pretty neat piece to make that much easier to accomplish. So on a CT26 turbo, the feed and the return are both on the bottom side of the turbo here. And I had an old flange that was used before on this car, but I'm not super keen on the way that it was constructed. It isn't my ideal way to knock it out, and that is where this next piece comes into play. So this is a CT26 feed and return flange from Drift Motion. And this provides a nice number 10 outlet and number 4 inlet for the oil to make its way to and from the turbo. It slips on just like that. A couple of simple fasteners hold it down, and now it's much easier to run an actual AN line from the engine to the oil inlet and from the oil outlet back to the pan. Alright, so it's time to make the oil feed line for the Mark II, and I have a new method of doing this that I wanted to show all of you. So the process by and large is the same as a normal thread together AN line construction, but where it differs is how I am going to incorporate this thermal sleeve, thermal barrier deal. Since the line is relatively close to the header, I want to have some sort of a thermal barrier in place. And this kind of rubberized fiberglass deal from Jegs, or you can get the same thing from a number of other retailers, that is going to be the ticket for making this happen. So the first thing I need to do is to cut my line to length. And I have a mark right here on the line where it needs to be cut. So rather than using an angle grinder or something that can put debris under the inside of the line, I like to use these vibrant shears, make a nice clean cut, and no real cleanup necessary afterwards. So it's just a matter of lining up my cut, pressing down, and there we go. I have my line cut to the length that it needs to be. So now this is where things will get a little bit different. And what I need to do next is figure out the length of my thermal barrier that I need to apply to this. So as I do this, so I don't end up fraying the end of the line unnecessarily, I'm going to take a piece of this paint tape, wrap it around the end of my line, or of my hose rather. Once I have my hose at its appropriate length with both of the, at least the nuts for the hose end on, now is when I come in with my thermal barrier. So I want this to sit kind of right on the edge of the nuts here. So what I'll do is just hold it up, keep my eye on it, make a mark, and then using my vibrant shears again, cut a section of our thermal barrier heat sleeve. All right, now that I have my piece of heat sleeving cut, I can pull the end of, or the hose end nut off on the tape side, and then slide my thermal barrier over it. And nice thing is you can slide this up on one of the nuts a little bit farther, so that way you're not having to contend with putting this together in a more difficult manner. So the next thing that I'm going to do is figure out the size of my Oetiker clamp. And what an Oetiker clamp is a semi-permanent hose clamp. And you'll see these somewhat regularly in OE applications. You can see kind of the pinch top to it, bottom side normal hose clamp type steel. But I'm using these simply to retain this thermal barrier onto the hose. So I'll need two of them, and this is where order of operations is important, as you don't want to assemble the hose and then go, oh crap, I can't fit my Oetiker clamp over. If you do the clamp first before you put the other hose end on, then it will actually be possible to do this. So you can see that I have my two Oetiker clamps on there, and at this point I can go ahead and take the tape off of this side and get it ready to be assembled. So now I can go ahead and always be sure to lubricate the portion of the hose end that is actually going into the hose, this kind of male nipple sticking off. And I know it sounds funny to say, make sure you lube your nipple, but it's a crucial part of doing this. If you don't apply a bit of lubricant to it, then it makes it really difficult to assemble them, especially once you get into larger sizes. And you can really tear up hose ends, and hose ends are not cheap. So I'll start it by hand, go as far as I can, like so. This one pretty close to bottoming it out. And then I'll come over to my vise blocks here, which these are AN vise blocks. They're designed to hold AN hose ends together as you are assembling them. Super handy piece to have. I highly recommend using them as opposed to just kind of clamping a hose end in the vise or something along those lines. Again, because you can really mess up the surface finish on these hose ends and really make your setup not look that great. Once everything is seated here, I prefer to use a steel wrench that is appropriately sized for the actual angle, the hose end portion of this. Reason for that is rather than using a crescent wrench that they don't always stay tight, or an aluminum wrench that doesn't stay in shape that well, a steel wrench, it maintains this distance across the open end very, very well, and it makes it really easy to put these together without marring them. So you still have to be careful. You don't want to slide the steel portion of the wrench over across the anodized fitting any more than you have to. The anodized surface finish, I should say. But using an appropriately sized wrench as opposed to other means is by far my preferred method of doing this. The final bit, as you're putting these together, is aligning the flats. Now, it is not a necessary step, and not one that affects the performance of the hose at all, but it's one that is just a little aesthetic deal that you can do that just shows a little bit of attention to detail and that you actually cared as you were putting the line together. So if you guys can see, I have my flats aligned, meaning that this portion I was just tightening down is aligned to the nut, and everything fits together nicely. So at this point, I can slide my heat sleeving into its position, slide my Oetiker clamps into their positions, and I'm just going to slide these up as far as I can towards each side, towards either side, I should say. I'll do my best to align them so this doesn't look goofy. And now, with my handy Oetiker tool, you just grab the two sides, squeeze, and pinch together. And I'm just using these Oetiker clamps as a way to retain the heat sleeving on my hose. So at this point, this is pretty much good to go. I'm going to smash the Oetiker deals down a little bit just so they're not quite as intrusive into the rest of the engine bay. But at this point, this line is good to go, ready to go on the car and ready to feed oil from the engine up to the turbo. Well, I started working on the oil filter relocation lines, and unfortunately, with the fittings that I have here right now, I can't get the lines to fit with the compressor outlet, or with the location of the compressor outlet. This is a very in-demand area of real estate right here, and it's just too tight to make it work with what I have on hand currently. So I went ahead and I ordered a handful of other fittings that'll give me a few different options of how I can make all of this work. Hopefully with a combination of the new fittings and what I have here already, I can make something come together and make something function appropriately for how these lines need to run. But I also had another interesting part come in, and something that has nothing to do with the performance of the car or the function of the car, but it's just kind of a little aesthetic touch that I thought was cool. So I had this old oil cap on the car, and it certainly works. It certainly would keep the oil in the engine, but it's kind of old and ugly and not exactly what I was after for this build. So as you guys know, I have a Greddy Type RS blow-off valve for this car. And the more that I've thought about it, the more that I've thought it would be cool to incorporate some parts from Greddy on this car, as they're one of the OG Japanese aftermarket parts manufacturers, and I think it's just really cool to include stuff like that on kind of an OG period build like this. So with that being said, I got myself a Greddy oil cap, and I had two different options for kind of the center sticker deal on this. I opted for this metal one, as I think it's a pretty classy look, pretty cool. And it also shows established 1977 on there. Pretty neat piece. So blue accents have been kind of the theme of this build. So there's a blue accent here. You can see the blue of the Injector Dynamics injector top hats down there. The blow-off valve itself, it has some blue pieces on it as well. So there's all kinds of little blue accents that are currently sprinkled throughout the engine bay and will continue to be sprinkled throughout it as I continue to put this car together. My new fittings and hose ends have arrived for the oil filter relocation on the Mark II, and I'm lucky enough where everything fits and the interference issues I was dealing with earlier are no longer a factor. So what we have here, if you guys can see what's going on, we have two tight radius 90-degree bends to AN tapered, or to male AN sides. Those two fittings, and then two hose ends in varying angles that allow everything to fit as a much tighter and more consolidated package. And most importantly, I'll be able to run the lines for the oil filter relocation. Well, after achieving something that I thought was impossible with the oil filter relocation lines, I think just about all of the plumbing aside from the water inlet and outlet for the turbo and some ancillary hard lines like the clutch line, brake lines, so on and so forth, is completed. So, like I just showed, the oil filter relocation lines, they are these two lines right here. Obviously, the block side plate and I guess a wide variety of parts, as you guys can see, are removed from the vehicle at this point in time. But the lines run from that side down underneath the subframe to these two lines right here. And the reason that everything is taken apart is I've assembled everything right here that will be going out for powder coating. So we have all the intercooler tubes. We have the oil filter relocation assembly. We have the coolant overflow and the catch can. All of these will be going to powder in the next few days. And hopefully by the time that you guys see this car again, all of these parts will be covered in a beautiful coat of wrinkled black and ready to go back on the car. Now I'll also be sending my old trusty CT26 out to my buddy Albert at ARM Turbo and Tuning for a rebuild, upgrade, so on and so forth. So this thing will be gone for a little bit. By the time it comes back, it will be a beautiful brand new turbo. And at that point, all of this stuff can be installed onto the car for good, and we're only a few items away from this car leaving to go for wiring. So another little bit that I did is I installed all of my new exhaust manifold studs and nuts and everything else. All this is squared away and ready to receive the header when everything is ready to go back together. So we got a decent amount accomplished in this video. All of the plumbing for that matter, and a few other little odds and ends. And with that in mind, I think I'm about out of things to do right now, and I can't make any more progress until parts are back from powder, the turbo is back from being rebuilt, and we can start putting this thing together once and for all. So I'll still need to knock out the water inlet and outlet for the turbo. I have a pretty good idea of how I'm going to do that, but we'll cover that at a later date. I also need to figure out the fan and shroud situation, but that needs to be done once the coolant overflow is back from powder, so that way I can build according to the clearances that I have and the space that I have for that. So with all of that being said, I think that will be about the end of this episode. So thank you guys, as always, for coming along on all these different journeys and adventures with me. And throughout the entire process, in the entire build series of putting the Mark II back together, I've enjoyed immensely having you guys along on this journey with me, and I hope that you have had fun coming along on the voyage with me. So from the bottom of my heart, I thank you all very much for taking time out of your collective days to come and see what I have going on here. I have a blast here day after day building parts and building all these different cars, and I hope that you guys have enjoyed the voyage with me. With all that being said, before I ramble on forever, that will be the end of this episode. So as always, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, check out the website for manifolds, for merch, for all things good that way, and I will see you all in the next episode.